What's up, everybody? It's about time for a new episode, and this one's a solo joint, so it's just me. I'm going to reflect on how my first semester at Abilene Christian University has gone, the nature of that experience, say a little about vocation, if that's a topic you're interested in. Then I'm going to talk a little church and a little Bible, and just have a kind of a reflection on a passage that I've recently thought about. And then I'm going to get into a pretty extended reflection on our cultural moment after the death of Charlie Kirk. So, could be interesting. Buckle in. All right, the first thing is how the semester's gone. It's been joy. That's the word. I have to talk about this in terms of joy because I've genuinely just had an amazing semester. It's not been easy necessarily, and there's certainly those moments where the work is overwhelming, and it's a job. Jobs are like that. But I can tell you that after so many years of working toward having a full-time position as a professor, because I worked part-time at a couple of institutions as an adjunct professor for a number of years. The classroom isn't exactly new to me, but the experience of joining a faculty, having an office on the hall, having a full teaching load, the whole thing has been mostly a dream, right? I didn't know what it would be like. I had hopes for what it would be like, and I can only tell you that it's been phenomenal. And that's not necessarily, well, typically even the experience of new professors. I mean, the first semester, the first year is kind of grueling. I knew that. I've watched other professors go through that. And so it's been a delightful surprise that for me, the work and the experience and the trials of all of that have just been fulfillment and a sense of joy that comes from that. I was sort of provoked to recall along the way something that one of my mentors said years ago about being in the mission field, landing in the mission field with teammates and sort of walking the city where they were sent and saying to his teammate, "Can you believe they're paying us to do this?" And that's the thing. I mean, that's what you want. That feeling that like I would do this. I would do this for free, and you're not supposed to say that because everybody's looking for a way to pay you less. But honestly, I mean, just to be sincere about it, it's like astonishing that I get to go to the office and prep classes and teach students and talk with students and interact with my colleagues, like all of that. Just a constant experience of looking around and going like, I cannot believe this is real and I'm getting paid to do this. It's amazing. That's genuinely been how the first semester has felt to me. Challenges notwithstanding, okay. One of the things we share with all of our incoming freshmen there's a class called Cornerstone. I got to teach that this semester, and it's sort of an orientation to liberal arts education. I call it freshman homeroom. I heard somebody else say that, and I think it's fitting. But along the way, one of the things that's shared with students is this pretty famous quote from Frederick Buechner, which is, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." And that just resonated with me as I reflected on my own experience of vocation. I happen to be preparing to teach a class that is centered on vocation this summer, so I'm reading a lot about it, and I undoubtedly will have more to share about the idea of vocation and so on. But for now, that quote, as it is for so many people, is just a wonderful starting point for thinking about, like, what is the root of this joy? What is it about this experience that causes me to say, I cannot believe I'm getting paid to do this. And it's the union of those two things, of deep gladness, of my love for study and scholarship and teaching and discipling, mentoring students, and collaboration with like-minded colleagues. Like, all of that is deep gladness combined with a hunger. And I mean, students, the best students, most students, I don't know, a lot of students bring that hunger. They're interested, they're leaning in, they're curious, and that is just amazing. It's been a phenomenal experience. Of course, I'm in the honeymoon phase of this. Um, we all know how that kind of works in all kinds of life experiences. So I'm not naive about, like, maybe I'll hit a wall. I don't know. But everything, teaching, the administrative stuff, I got thrown on multiple committees. The burden of working toward tenure and promotion, which is like this constant grind if you're in the academy. If you don't know about this, the way that this works, especially at institutions that, what we call them, teaching institutions, teaching universities, where the focus is not on having faculty that do a lot of research, but faculty that carry a heavy teaching load. The way this works is you have your job, which is primarily the teaching and committees, administration stuff. But in order to get promoted and in order to eventually attain tenure, you also have to do a bunch of other stuff scholarship-wise. You have to produce, you have to do the research and writing and so on. And that's just sort of on top. And that feels like a burden to a lot of people. And I understand why. But even that, even knowing that that's there and it's sort of like on my shoulder and I'm thinking about, okay, how do I budget my time and when can I carve out time to write and all of that. It's just like, this is amazing. And so, yeah, that's all I can tell you about what the experience has been like. And I have to give a shout out to my colleagues, because there are lots of different experiences among professors, lots of different cultures at schools and in departments, and there's many ways that can go. My colleagues have been amazing, outstanding, collaborative, helpful, welcoming, warm, generous. I can say nothing but good things about the Abilene Christian University Department of Bible Missions and Ministry. And you know who you are, my friends. If you're listening, thank you. It's been a delight, and I look forward to many years to come. And at the same time, there's a lot of grief that comes with this transition. I started thinking about this and sort of working through this pretty quickly after our transition to Abilene, having left a church family that we deeply love and friends, co-workers in the gospel, people that we shared in ministry with and dreamed with and shed those proverbial blood, sweat, and tears with. It was hard and remains hard. It's tough to sit in a different church Sunday after Sunday, just to be frank. I miss my friends. And that caused me to pick up a couple of books and just start processing. I reached for C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. Very different kind of grief, right? He lost a spouse and journaled about it and eventually turned that into a book. But there's something about that observance of grief that to me applies to all kinds of sad human experiences of loss. And I think what I took from it, the main thing that stood out to me in this reading, was the way that grief is so much about coping with a longing for the past, a longing for the way things were that can never be again, and coming to terms with that. And I won't talk about the death of those relationships, because those relationships persist. They change, they grow, they go in different directions. I've gone through that many times in my life, as have almost all of you. Um, this one just hit me hard. It was a real struggle, and as I said, continues to be. And I recognized in myself that longing, that that kind of nostalgia for a moment that happened. It came and it went, and in order to say yes to the vocation, I had to say goodbye to some things that I dearly loved, and that I thank God for, and that many things I didn't expect. I mean, things that happened along the way during those years in Middle Tennessee that were the product of prayer. They were the fruit of another kind of longing, of wishing for relationships and opportunities, and looking for God to work and trying to join into that. And so much of that along the way became a reality that it hurt very much to leave it. Another book that I reached for was, again, Frederick Buechner's The Sacred Journey. I was gifted a copy of this when I graduated from Fuller, and I hadn't touched it until I was looking around and thinking, how do I process? And of course, here at Theology on the Way, the journey is the primary metaphor, and it dominates my thinking about so many things. And not knowing what I would find, I just cracked it open and started reading. And it turned out to be really sober and lovely. Buechner's a famously beautiful writer. Reflection on his life, his young life, his early years, and what to make of the tragedies and the moments that transpired. And that was really helpful to me. It was helpful to recognize the nostalgia in that recounting, as well as the retrospective appreciation for the things that God had done. And that's been so important to me. I've recognized over the recent 4 or 5 months, in a new way, I guess, things that happened over the years, even before Murfreesboro, before those relationships and other relationships, other opportunities, other moments, gifts that had been given that made me who I am and paved the way, created the path for where I am now. That's a difficult accounting to give. It is really not. I mean, thank God if it is for you. If you look back and you can just sort of connect those dots easily. I find that it's pretty challenging sometimes to even recall what you wanted, what you asked for, what happened, and then to recognize why that matters for where you are now, and how the twists and turns in the road were necessary and life-giving in surprising ways and challenging in necessary ways. And that's sort of what Buechner was helping me process as I read The Sacred Journey. So I guess I would just wrap up this little reflection by saying God is good. I mean, God has been faithful. That's been a mantra in our family, and I know that many of you share that sentiment. It's amazing to see the ways in which God has worked far beyond our expectations, certainly beyond our imagination, to bring things together and bring us to this particular moment. I'll just leave it there. Let me just leave it at praise. Joy, grief, This is the tension that we live in, and I'm grateful for it. All right, so let's do a little biblical reflection. I'm kind of hesitant about this. I mean, I sometimes think I don't want to get too preachy or expositional on the podcast, but I'm always thinking about the biblical text and interpretation, so I go back and forth. This one, I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to share it. So we'll see how this goes. Feedback is welcome. We were in a class on Hebrews recently. I had the privilege not long ago back at Stones River Church in Murfreesboro of co-preaching through Hebrews. So it's been on my mind, but then we were in this class and one of the teachers posed an interesting question that juxtaposed Hebrews 2:1 and 2:15 and caused me to think a little bit. And so I want to share a little bit of that. 2:1 says this: "Therefore we must pay greater attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift away from it." And then the writer goes on to say a bunch of other stuff. And we get to 2:15. I'm going to back up a little bit to 2:14 because 15 is a sentence fragment. "Since, therefore, the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things," Jesus, "so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death." Right. The question the teacher posed was something like, what does paying attention have to do with the fear of death? What's the connection between the exhortation, we need to pay greater attention to what we've heard, and then the statement that what Christ has accomplished is to free those who all our lives have been held in slavery by not death, but the fear of death. And there were some interesting comments that really made me cringe, to be honest. Comments to the effect of, well, because I believe in the gospel, I believe that Jesus saves me, I know what my destination is. I know where I'm going to end. I'm going to heaven. And so even though I'm dying, I'm in this process of dying, and maybe it'll be soon, and maybe it'll be sometime down the road. I know I'm dying, and I don't have to live my life in fear of death because I know I will be saved. And that sentiment, although I grant its legitimacy, is disturbing to me. I mean, I really don't like it. Legitimate meaning, I get it. I get what you're saying. I understand where that idea is coming from. But I don't like it because I think it misses the point, and worse, positions the church in a role that it is wrong. No, that's not strong enough. Let me put it like this: it turns the church into hospice, and that is damn near heresy. I mean, it is scary wrong to think about the implications of that way of thinking. Faith is not palliative care for people inching toward the inevitable. That's literally Marx's opiate of the masses. That is to affirm my faith and my belief that Jesus is going to free me from death means I don't have to be afraid now, and I can live my life and be happy and content because when I die, everything's going to turn out fine. That's the opiate of the mass. That is not Christianity, and it's certainly not what the Hebrew author is claiming. The church is not a hospice. The church is the people of God, called from and sent into the world to participate in the mission of God. as the Hebrew writer says later in the book, we don't neglect meeting together, doing church. Why? We don't neglect it in order to provoke one another to love and good works. Like, that's the result of freedom from the fear of death. Love and good works. That's why freedom from the fear of death matters. We're not just waiting around to die. Glad that it's not so scary. We're loving fearlessly, whatever the cost. We're doing good works. Consequences be damned. That is why we pay attention to what we've heard. Like that, the exhortation is pay attention to the significance of the gospel that the good news, the liberative action of God. Like God has set you free for something, not just to die unafraid. Christ has pioneered a way of life, again, borrowing the Hebrew writer's language, a way of life that journeys through and beyond death. That way of life has already begun for everyone who follows him. That's the sense of freedom from the fear of death. I really want the church to grasp that to the extent possible. We're at a point now where it's clear to me that so many Christians are in this mindset of being saved in order to go to heaven someday that they see no connection between the way they're living now and freedom from the fear of death. But it's absolutely essential. This is who we are. We are not afraid to live because we are not afraid to die. That is what Hebrews is about. So pay attention. Pay attention to what you've heard. Okay. Now we're going to get into the murky waters of what? Culture war? The the upheaval that has been provoked by the death of Charlie Kirk. I generally try to stay out of the culture war space that Kirk inhabited. It's not my bag. And actually, much of my disagreement with him, let me just say this up front, disagreement with him was about the representation of his work as a Christian way of engaging politically. It's not. Okay? So that's out of the way. That's where I am. But his assassination has provoked some serious reflection that I figure belongs here, if anywhere. Okay, so Kirk was killed on a university campus as he engaged in public debate. Public as it may be, that is a personal space for anyone engaged in higher education. So I'm in my first semester at a university, and I felt this in a very sharp way. Everybody everybody with compassion and humanity felt the death and the loss and all of that. But the nature of the assassination on a higher education campus hit home for those of us who teach. For me, the issue isn't just free speech or political violence, important as those issues are. It's the fact that his murder took place in the midst of the very purpose for which liberal arts institutions exist. That is, critical engagement with ideas. Now, I have friends, I have colleagues, there are people in my life who are going to object immediately and say, that's not what he was doing. Those performances and those so-called debates weren't actually that. We can agree to disagree. I'm not speaking about the quality of the public engagement or even the particulars of the ideas that he presented. That's all irrelevant as far as I'm concerned. The university is supposed to be where bad ideas come to die and good ideas come to flourish. Yes, that's an idealistic statement, but idealism is at home in the university too. The institution's aspirational. Students bring all sorts of dumb ideas to class, and professors bring the hope of ushering students through a purifying intellectual fire that tempers or transforms or eradicates those ideas. And Kirk was a genius for bringing his political activism to university campuses. But not just for the obvious reasons, not just because that's where young people are. His sights were set on prospective young voters, okay, and he recruited many of them successfully, yes. But the real genius of Turning Point strategy was challenging college students to bring their dumb ideas to the microphone and test them in a public exchange. Not a private conversation, not a social media post, a dialogue. Again, caveats, whatever. Dialogue of some kind. And anybody who's complaining about the nature of those dialogues ought to reckon with the fact that I've watched a lot of Charlie Kirk videos. I've never once seen a professor step up to that microphone and make a better case. So you can say he's beating up on naive college students that don't really know what they're talking about. Whatever. The opportunity's there. Anybody that wants to say something can, and no, he doesn't control what gets published. Everybody in the crowd has a 4K camera in their pocket. That's not the point. It's a kind of dialogue. It's public, and it's happening on the university campus. Going to the university setting where dialogue about ideas is a part of the educational process is the best possible strategy. Agree or disagree with what he's interested in, what he's advocating, it's still the best possible strategy. Now, we've seen killings in educational settings. We've seen university shootings. We have yet to see someone assassinated for challenging or presenting ideas on a U.S. American university campus. Maybe ever, but certainly not in my lifetime. The unique implications of that violence are chilling, to say the least. What Kirk did required courage, and I'm happy to grant that. Whatever else anybody wants to, it's a courageous thing. Certainly for someone with a high school education like him, it takes courage to enter the university setting and defend intellectual claims. Just ask my freshman. And more than that, it takes courage to do that over and over on camera with no script in the midst of virulent dissent. Well, what I'm thinking is how much more courage is required in a culture where speaking one's mind on a university campus may get you killed? What will the price for this murder be culturally and intellectually? I don't think we know yet. Kirk's life is a steep enough price. Full stop. But the fear that his death will engender has an unfathomable cost because of where it happened. So, yes, I'm deeply disturbed by someone being killed on a university campus for expressing ideas, regardless of the content of those ideas. My reason for thinking out loud about these things is more specifically Christian. None of the Christian friends I have in mind are delighted by Kirk's death. None of them have said he got what he deserved. They weren't a part of that whole phenomenon of heinous speech about his death. The troubling thing I find about my friends' comments is actually that they are committed to nonviolence. But at the same time, think about Kirk's killing as in some way equivalent to the so-called violence he did. Obviously, I think, these friends are on the progressive end of the spectrum. They view Kirk's words as doing violence to certain groups of people. And that's the case because he didn't engage in physical violence. That can't be what they mean when they refer to him doing violence. In other words, the ascription of violence to Kirk requires a wider conception of the word's meaning. Let me say clearly, I'm not in the words or violence camp. Certainly not in the U.S. American political context today. I realize that verbal abuse is real. I realize that the expression of policy positions can or does result in actual violence, and that blurs the line. I'm not being obtuse. I'm distinguishing between the articulation of ideas and shooting someone in the neck. That distinction shouldn't need defense, but it does. We live in a world where not only do people regularly claim that expressing a traditional Christian view of human sexuality causes bigotry, abuse, and suicide, but also a world where merely hearing a given position about many such issues, not only that one, many such issues, results in, quote, harm, trauma, and violence. Now, Christians tread a fine line on these issues. And Christian professors, I would say, more so. Compassion, caution, and consideration are the right starting point. But at the same time, we do not want to live in a world where making theological claims is liable to accusations of hate or, much more, violence, simply by virtue of being contrary to the moral sensibilities of the church's host culture. We need to keep in mind that Jesus is Lord is an exclusive moral claim that can be construed as hateful and violent on the exact same logic that anyone else's exclusive moral claims, including Kirk's, can be. In a culture where, quote, that idea hurts me is the measure of violence, to say that my Jesus circumvents the issue because he's compassionate or accepting or whatever is impotent. Your Jesus, however compassionate he may be, is still an exclusivist in ways that might be called violent, or he is not the Jesus of Scripture. The only question is whether Christian morality of any variety worth the name is doing actual violence. In my estimation, it's not. Now, let's talk about policy implications. Kirk's Second Amendment advocacy in particular. Can we, nonviolent Christians, say that Kirk's advocacy of the Second Amendment justifies the statement, live by the sword, die by the sword? That's a quotation from Matthew 26:52. We cannot. Sure, anyone who wants to live in a world where every person can defend their ideas with violence should expect that some people will do so. But to assert that in such a world violence is a necessary consequence is a non sequitur. It does not follow. To assert that advocates of the Second Amendment should expect to be shot to death because of their ideas is total nonsense. By the same logic, someone who affirms the appropriateness of an armed police force should expect police brutality. Or someone who believes in the right to self-defense without firearms should expect to get stabbed or beaten to death by people with opposing ideas. Still, I'm not primarily concerned with calling out a logical fallacy. That's what I've been talking about. I'm concerned about the consequences of this way of thinking, which few seem to be noticing. What happened to Charlie Kirk looks to me like a consequence of the compassionate, inclusive left, including nonviolent Christians of that persuasion, promoting the idea that words are just as violent as physical assault, combined with the idea that those who commit such violence will reap what they sow. And I'm not talking about blame. That belongs to the person who pulled the trigger. I'm talking about a blindness to the implications of affirming that Kirk's public positions were a form of violence in a world where even the pacifists say, see, violent people die by violence. We have arrived at an unprecedented cultural moment. The people who decry violence have decided violence is the way to stop it. Antifa was the first major manifestation of this turn. And I have friends who will happily advocate for Antifa, saying something like, what, you're not against fascism? And I would just point out that that's exactly the same as saying, what, you're against making America great again? Like, let's be honest here. We know exactly what these things are. So let's not pretend there's something else. The debate about just what fascist means in 2025 and whether it should be applied to Trump or MAGA or the likes of Charlie Kirk has not been mere semantic wrangling for rhetorical gains. It has been about framing the perceived threat of violence from Trump's right toward vulnerable minority groups in order to identify its ideology, its public speech, with Hitlerian intentions that justify armed resistance in the American imaginary. Let me say that in another way. Using that language is a way of saying those people deserve to be violently resisted. That's what the language is about. It's no coincidence that the inscriptions on Tyler Robinson's shell casings include references to fascism, including the phrase, "Hey fascist, catch." Now, I've read a lot of equivocation about the possibility of knowing his motivations. I, for one, don't think it's much of a leap to conclude that Kirk was killed for ideas perceived as violent. And I implore listeners not to take easy refuge in the thought that Robinson is just a disturbed individual who represents nothing more than derangement. Here's a quote. According to the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education's annual college free speech ranking survey, in 2020, the national average showed about 1 in 5 students said it was ever acceptable to use violence to stop a speaker. That number has since risen to a disturbing 1 in 3 students. Now, 1 in 5 is bad enough. 1 in 3 students saying yes, if someone's speech is problematic enough, it's fine to use violence to shut them up, is a catastrophe for us. So I repeat, we're at an unprecedented moment culturally. And we can easily identify examples in American history of violence used against the violent or oppressive in the name of protection, liberation, love. And of course, the Civil War would count as one rather large example. By contrast, the number of examples of violence against people who do nothing more than hold hateful ideas or say hateful things is diminishingly small. But once the culture accepts that Charlie Kirk's words, ideas, and policy positions can be classified as a violent, fascist even, then live by the sword, die by the sword gets applied to speech, and someone will pull the trigger. Christians, at least, must resist this cultural tide. We must accept neither that speech is violence, however mistaken one's ideas are, nor that living by the sword means dying by the sword. That's right. Jesus and the Christian martyrs are our guides in both regards. Let me take each of those in turn. First, for us, speech is powerful, consequential, but calling it violence is a category mistake. Too many of us have been killed for speech for the difference not to be obvious. Jesus was killed for speech, for ideas. These ideas were deemed a threat to the empire and the religious status quo both. Christians in the first few centuries after Christ were killed for speech. Their ideas were deemed a threat to the empire, to the stability of society, the prosperity of the economy, the well-being of the family. They were killed for not saying the right words. Caesar is God. They were killed for saying the wrong words. Jesus is Lord. In every case, the difference between espousing ideas and torturing or killing people is stark. In the New Testament, Christians are exhorted to beware the effects of their words, but also encouraged to understand the words spoken against them and the effects of those words to be an opportunity to practice endurance, to give an account for our hope. If all that happens through speech is disdain, humiliation, marginalization, that's not violence. It is an opportunity to speak back, to say more, to bear witness. And it may hurt emotionally, but it is not violence. As anyone who has experienced real violence knows. Second, for us, living by the sword, even when it is turned upon us, means blessing. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing, is our point of departure. Even as we live in solidarity with those who suffer real violence, we live first in solidarity with the triune God. And the blessing of violent enemies is our way of life. We embody an alternative to retributive violence. Jesus' statement, quote, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword," is a statement about the way things are, not the way they must be. Certainly not once his disciples follow his lead. His command to Peter, who intended to defend Jesus from violence with violence, opens a new possibility. No longer do those who live by the sword have to die by the sword, not where the kingdom of God is breaking in. As U.S. American culture increasingly reaches for the sword or the firearm, the church must stand in the way and tell the truth. Violence, political or otherwise, is wasted on those who hope in the resurrection. Okay, that's enough on that dimension of culture. Let me pivot to another. And this is just a teaser. I plan to release a number of episodes where I deal with, let me say it this way, I dissect, I break down a really interesting conversation that I think is representative of something fascinating going on culturally. I'm referring to the appearance of Wes Huff, a biblical scholar of sorts, on the Flagrant podcast. Now, let me say some things about both of those entities. Wes is a very successful YouTuber who speaks about like a lot of biblical and Christianity-related topics from a scholarly perspective. He's essentially a historian, a textual scholar of sorts, and I'll explain more about that when I get into the first episode, breaking down the podcast. But he's done incredibly well for himself, and certainly has my respect. I love what he's doing. I think it's really significant. And he broke through enough to end up on Joe Rogan's podcast, which I mentioned his appearance in a previous episode. But then he's making the rounds, and he ends up on another podcast, another comedy podcast that I listen to called Flagrant. Now, the name is a clear indication of what you should expect if you decide to listen to some of these episodes. These fellas are unfiltered, and they're certainly not speaking in ways that church people tend to speak. That doesn't bother me much, and there could be some interesting reflections on that in particular, but I'm going to skip it for now and just say I really appreciate their curiosity and their openness and interest in Christianity. In fact, I even quoted one of their podcast episodes a couple of years ago in a sermon because it was so poignant and significant, and they've not stopped pondering from time to time what Christianity is about and what the Bible really is worth and all of those sorts of questions. And so they had Wes Huff on, and I think this episode was really significant. I mean, it's representative, as I said, of a great deal in the culture among those who are not church people. And so I want to walk through it. I want to break down his approach, their questions, what's at stake. And Wes is not a theologian. He is coming at this from a different angle, and I'll say more about that as well. But let me just give you a little preview, a little taste of where this is going as the episode opens, and I'll leave it at that. And you can tune in another episode as I begin to scrutinize exactly how he answers their questions, what questions they're asking, why they matter, and how church people should go about trying to respond to these kinds of concerns.
What's up, people? Today we are joined by the most bodaciously brolic Bible expert you've ever seen, a true man of God. Wesley Huff, or as Billy Carson calls him, White Devil, is here to break down the big questions. Which version of Christianity is the truth? Did Jesus make it to India? That explains how he walked on water because it's so polluted. Also, were there actual giants in the Bible? What's up with the book of Enoch? Are Christmas and Easter just some old pagan holidays? And can non-Christians still get into heaven? Indulge. Hey. Wesley, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm very excited for you to be here. We must state that I'm not taking any credit for your success. Neither is Mark, neither is Alex, neither is Akash.
Never.
Okay?
I'll give it to you.
No, don't do it because you earned your success, okay? And, Jesus, look at that fucking thing.
I know, dude. God bless.
Making me a Christian. And the other thing. And then,
you gotta put the test back in New Testament.
There we go. Let's go.
That's fire.
Come with
Man in
bars,
manuscripts.
bro. Come with bars. Okay. The Billy Carson debate.
Mm-hmm.
Does it sprout from you reacting to Billy on our podcast?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I made response videos.
Yes.
To you guys.
Yes.
Because people kept sending it to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, did you watch the whole episode when we were like, we're not fact checking any of this? This is just for fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you were like, I'm going to fact check the fuck out of it.
Well, because people kept sending me these clips.
I know. It's the thing about Billy is like, I know he's full of shit, but he doesn't know he's full of shit. And that's why, at least I didn't think he was a con artist. I was like, he really believes it. And this is kind of fun. So we're like, listen, we're going to have some fun today. But then when things get clipped out and put on the internet, people believe it 100%.
When he's so confident.
Yes.
You know what's funny? I was just in Turkey, and Billy's now in Turkey. I missed him by a week. We were in the exact same location.
Wow.
We could have. I had this thought.
Yes.
When we went, because I went to Derinkuyu, which is the underground city in Cappadocia.
Yeah.
And I had the thought when we were like going in, I was like, what are the chances I run into Billy Carson down here? Because he'd said in an interview last year that he was going to go to Derinkuyu in a year. And it was like almost the exact same time frame. I had that thought. Didn't happen. It would have been fun.
Like what would have happened if you guys ended up in the same place?
He's ducking
I don't know.
you, bro.
I don't even know. Yeah.
Have you guys spoken since? What's up with the lawsuit? Like, fill us in, dude.
No, the lawsuit didn't amount to much because there was no credibility to the lawsuit. You can't sue for not liking what you yourself said.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It's okay. But, yeah, I mean, I haven't heard anything from him, nor do I necessarily need to. I don't want to be the guy that took down Billy Carson. I don't want that to be my legacy.
Yeah, I don't think that's her
It can
legacy.
be my origin story.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be my legacy.
He's still doing all right.
Yeah, Billy's gonna be fine.
yeah, for sure.
People still want to believe in aliens. They want to
believe
believe in all this stuff. You believe in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. You got a necklace about it. Al is 100% locked in. Al's a flat earther. There's a lot of things that we got. What do you think about flat Earth? What's your?
I don't know. I mean, I've been in an airplane and up in the sky, and I think I've seen the curve, but I don't know.
You don't know.
the windows.
I'm not a scientist.
Exactly.
Don't make me
What
say
are
sciencey
you?
things.
What are you exactly?
I'm a historian.
Yes, we know
Yes.
that. But then there's another thing.
What is it?
I don't know. I was looking up your exact title, and I was like, "There's no way I'm going to memorize it." But your specialty, your PhD, is in.
Biblical manuscripts.
Okay.
So ancient scribal culture. So I study ancient scribes and how they produce and copy and disseminate manuscripts.
So you're testing for efficacy of these ancient scribes.
Yeah, different things. So like there's a field called textual criticism, which looks at the text of particular documents.
Yeah.
Because in the ancient world, we don't have any originals. Everything's a copy, no matter what it is. And even if we found, quote unquote, an original, I don't know how we
What makes
we
something
verify
an
it.
original?
The author writes it.
But like, so the author could write 40 of them, and then we would deem that an original? Or
Well, like whatever, like say we find Plato's Republic and it was one that was written by him. Or like, how would we verify that
it's actually
was
written by
actually
him?
But everything we have are copies, and most of them are like hundreds of years after because old things wear out.
Yeah.
And so textual criticism looks at the text and the copies and looks at internal and external factors and traces the original back.
Okay. Question.
That's not what I do, but it's related.
Okay, I just have a question about this.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is possible that you could find an older version of the Bible, or there could be a newer version of the Bible that is more accurate than an older version of the Bible because the older version had a copying mistake.
Yeah.
And right, and so how would you identify that?
Because there are so many copies. The thing with the Bible is that you have so many copies, far more copies than you have of any other ancient document.
Okay. Why is that?
The Christians really wanted
'Cause we're the
to
best.
copy it. Is that why? They're like, we don't got enough of
get
these
your
things.
copying up, Jews.
It's
and
like
Muslims.
Oprah,
What
you
the
get a
fuck?
copy, and you get a copy, and you get a copy. Well, part of it was like the Christians were Muslims call us the people of the book, right? Christians and Jews, because we have a scripture and that's like central to
The
what
belief system.
we believe.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not necessarily true for like other ancient religious practices.
Got it.
In fact, that's the argument. There's a end of 1st century, beginning of 2nd century Jewish guy named Josephus.
Okay.
And so he writes a document called the Antiquities of the Jews. And in it, he talks about the differentiation between like the Greek religious practices, the Greco-Roman religious practices, and the Jewish religious practices by saying we don't have just an unlimited amount of religious texts like you guys have. We only have this.
Yes.
And part of the reason we know what the books of the Old Testament were in Jesus' day, part of the conversation is that Josephus outlines them. He gives a number and an argument for the list of books and what the books are.
Okay, so from there we have this idea. Because why would he lie or mislead about this time if his argument is to prove that this is the limited amount of books that we have?
Yeah, I mean, he has no reason to like make it up one way or the other. And then you have, so the New Testament authors quote the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Like a lot.
Yeah.
And so we have evidence from, okay, well, Jesus, Paul, Peter, they're quoting this stuff and they're saying like, this is scripture. They're advocating for it and arguing like theological stuff on the basis of these texts. So we can also look at how they're treating scripture.
Yeah.
And then there are other stuff, Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that.
Okay, what is the earliest version of the Bible? How do we, What is the
this
Bible?
question sounds familiar.
Yeah.
What is the earliest version of the Bible? Well, what do you mean by version?
I think that's where I'm going with the question, which is like, what were people consuming at the time?
So there's a taste of the conversation, and we'll get into it in multiple other episodes, break it down, and try to figure out exactly what's really going on in this conversation. I think it's relevant and fun and interesting. So I'm looking forward to it, and we'll see you on that one and any other episode that happens in the meantime. All right, peace.